Story 1. True Damascus steel is not a lost art in any sense of the word, even if people constantly repeat that myth. Not only did people write down recipes from as far back as Al-Kindi and earlier Zosimos, for example, gives a vague but not inaccurate description, but also as recently as eyewitness accounts from 1903 by Ananda Kumaraswamy. Production continued until that time and resumed as soon as people had the material testing equipment to get the composition right, as documented by Wadsworth and Verhoeven. True Damascus steel is also not folded or layered. These days, many people can make pattern-forming crucible Damascus steel with historic compositions. Story 2. Paul Revere never completed his midnight ride because he was arrested. Sybil Luddington's ride was more successful than Paul Revere's. Story 3. The idea that medieval people only lived to age 30 is incorrect. The average life expectancy was low due to high infant mortality, but adults often lived long lives. Story 4. While the Founding Fathers were pro-business, they were not pro-corporation. They supported sole proprietorships and partnerships but were adamantly against corporations, having just won the first anti-corporate war. The Founding Fathers were so suspicious and concerned about corporations that they required them to apply for state-controlled charters and prove that the corporation would serve the public good, such as building a railroad or a dam. No value to society meant no corporate protections. Since then, there has been a complete reversal. Now, a business cannot have a social mission unless it declares it at the start or files as a benefit corporation. Story 5. Claudette Colvin, a 15-year-old African-American girl, was actually the first to refuse to give up her seat on the bus for a white passenger. This occurred 9 months before Rosa Parks. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and others decided Parks was a better figurehead because she was an adult. So, it is true what Rosa Parks did, but Claudette Colvin did it first. Story 6. I grew up in Kansas, about 3 hours from Tulsa, Oklahoma. There was a brief mention of a race riot in the Greenwood neighborhood of Tulsa in 1921, and that a few people died. It was not until I was in my 30s that I learned the truth about the Tulsa massacre. The event was not just removed from history books. In most cases, it was never included at all. Story 7. The burning of the Library of Alexandria did not set humanity back with all official knowledge lost. It was similar to the Library of Congress in its time. The information inside was a copy, as it was believed that having a copy of texts and other items was a good idea. Story 8. Thomas Edison was a great inventor. He improved other people's inventions and patented and sold them. Story 9. The first United States settlers were fleeing religious persecution. The said religious persecution involved being told that they could not religiously persecute others. Tale as old as time, I suppose. Edit. Apparently, I do not know as much as I thought I did on this topic. Story 10. I grew up in Alabama, and as part of our history, we were taught that only wealthy landowners owned slaves. Most people with small farms did not. However, I was looking for information about something in my area and examined the census records from that time. Yes, there were large landowners with slaves, some owning over 100 enslaved people, but there were also many people who owned 1 to 3 slaves. So it was not entirely true what we were taught. I do not know how it was elsewhere, but in my county at least, many people owned slaves. Story 11. As a child in the United States, I remember always being glad that the good guys won every war they taught us about. Story 12. It was not so much that General George Armstrong Custer lost the Battle of the Little Bighorn as that the Native American forces won it. Story 13. Hitler's art was dry and uninspiring but showed solid technical ability and an excellent grasp of color and shading. I do not understand people who say he was not talented. If his paintings had not been created by one of the worst individuals in history, they would look great in a nice, cozy living room. Story 14. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House thereafter had 2 enemies. The anti-war left and black people. Former Nixon domestic policy chief John Ehrlichman told Harper's writer Dan Baum for the April cover story published Tuesday. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and black people with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities, Ehrlichman said. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Vote locally in efforts to decriminalize nature. Story 15. In school, we were taught that Christopher Columbus was somewhat of a good person. But what they did not tell us was that when he discovered America, he slaughtered and enslaved thousands of Native Americans. Story 16. Honest Abe Lincoln was a politician most modern politicians would recognize. He was willing to lie, cheat, and steal, and also hassle the press corps of the time. It was not uncommon for journalists back then to be briefly jailed for writing articles favoring the Confederacy. Of course, that technically violated the Constitution, so they were released fairly quickly, but the point was made. George Washington was, by all historical accounts, not a good field general. He was mostly good at raising an army that did not completely desert under fire, which was important, but repeatedly made basic tactical blunders in the field. Story 17. In the early 1960s, a Viking settlement was discovered in Nova Scotia. This should have ended the narrative of Christopher Columbus being the first European to set foot on the continent. But the misconception continued through public education. Story 18. There was no famine in Ireland. There was a potato blight. There were shiploads of food leaving the country for Britain every day. Story 19. Pocahontas and John Rolfe fell in love and got married. This is false. Pocahontas was held hostage by the English to prevent the Powhatan from attacking Jamestown. While in captivity, she was tortured and raped by several people, likely including John Rolfe. She had at least one child resulting from the abuse who died shortly after birth. This information is known because the English allowed her to visit her sister unsupervised as a gesture of good faith, and Pocahontas revealed what had happened. The wedding was arranged after the English realized their mistake and feared that if her sister returned home first, a Powhatan war party would soon follow to Jamestown. The English escorted her sister home and announced Pocahontas's conversion to Christianity and engagement to John Rolfe before she could speak. The best-case scenario is that Pocahontas developed Stockholm Syndrome and bonded with John Rolfe because she felt safest with him. More likely, it was a forced marriage to hide her abuse and protect the English from retaliation. Story 20. It is a misconception that I have no idea how it came to be. People think primitive equals stupid or unskilled. It is so prevalent that it must somehow be taught. I often hear people say that at any specific time, something could not be done because it was not invented yet. Give our ancestors some credit for their ingenuity. Story 21. George Washington never won an election. He was appointed by Congress. This is not so much a lie as it is something that is rarely discussed. Story 22. Dinosaurs became extinct not because they were slow, unintelligent creatures with small brains, but because they were unlucky. They thrived for almost 150 million years until a random space rock struck the Earth. This is not a failure of evolution, especially considering that modern humans, Homo sapiens, have existed for less than 1 million years. Story 23. One issue that really irritates me is also likely to make others angry. It concerns the story of Abraham Lincoln and the end of slavery. When Abraham Lincoln was elected, he had no intention of freeing the slaves or ending slavery. He aimed only to stop the slave trade from expanding further north because of the large influx of white Europeans coming to America and needing work. The Emancipation Proclamation exists because many slaves freed themselves and fled to the north. Those who made it were offered legal freedom if they fought for the Union Army. By the time the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, so many slaves had freed themselves that Lincoln had no choice but to completely abolish slavery. This error in history teaching bothers me for a couple of reasons. 1. History should show that while a constitutional amendment legally granted freedom to slaves, it was really the slaves who freed themselves. I believe they deserve the majority of the credit. Instead, the government chose to praise the white man who only signed a paper. This event also reveals how politically conservative people often create their own problems. In this case, they wanted to keep their slaves but refused to accept the ban on selling slaves north of a certain line. Instead, they caused a war that ultimately cost them the right to own slaves. Conservatives have repeated this pattern many times. Story 24. Almost everything taught in American schools about the Puritans, also known as the Pilgrims of Rhode Island Colony and Massachusetts Colony, is incorrect. They were not seeking religious freedom. They lost a war in England where they tried to impose fascism and genocide. They moved to Holland, were expelled from there, hid in England for a few years, and then moved west. They were far from the first white settlers in their landing area, much less in the New World. Jamestown Colony was over a decade old at that point, and New Amsterdam was already a bustling colonial metropolis. Other colonies in the New World were a century older than anything the Puritans had, but Jamestown was only 17 years prior, not a century. They did not host a Thanksgiving as it is commonly portrayed. Celebrations of any kind were forbidden. It was a feast of sorts, but not a Thanksgiving in the usual sense. They did not really have farming problems. They were inexperienced the first year and did not grow storable foods, so this is somewhat true. The land was fertile and grew well. They were responsible for mass murder of anyone who disagreed with them. They slaughtered native towns and even fellow white people because the Quakers were not their kind of Christian. They are distinctly responsible for what later was called the French and Indian War indirectly. Prince Philip's War led other tribes to distrust English colonists, which contributed to that war. The policies they enacted eventually led to tragic events such as the Trail of Tears and the massacre of the Sioux people. These policies can be traced to descendants of the Puritans. They also slaughtered their own people. The Salem witch trials were not the first witch trials on American soil, but they were Puritan-based. American schools generally portray them as poor waifs just seeking religious freedom, which is misleading. Story 25. The Second Amendment and the belief of the Founding Fathers that it was critically important for civilians to keep and bear arms are intrinsically linked to their deep and profound belief that the United States should never have a standing army. When you understand that the Founding Fathers firmly opposed the existence of a standing army, the first sentence of the Second Amendment makes much more sense. Story 26. 8% of Asian people are related to Genghis Khan is a common myth. Often on platforms like Reddit or less reliable news sources, you will see this claim. It is based on misrepresented evidence and theories. The DNA evidence used for this claim is considered dubious at best. Researchers identified a specific Y chromosome genetic haplogroup and claimed it was from his bloodline. A Russian genetic laboratory found that 24% of Mongolians have this haplogroup, and it is also present in nearby Turkish regions. While there are certainly many genetic descendants through his direct family, we cannot directly prove any specific percentage. Story 27. I find it interesting how many of these I am seeing here are just as inaccurate as the initial inaccuracy they seek to fix. Political party switch. The Democrats became a whole different party and took up progressivism as its central tenet. The Republicans, however, just remained the same. It was not a swap. It was one party completely redefining itself in a full 180-degree turn from their past. In summary, there was no swap. Christopher Columbus, by no means a saint. He did some terrible things. At the same time, much of what we are seeing is inaccurate. The majority of the atrocities he is being held responsible for were committed after his death by his son. The British pushed out propaganda against the Spanish, and in it, many of the deeds of his son and others were superimposed onto him. Some things in our modern day were also imposed onto different groups. As far as we know, he was not chopping off the hands of the natives. He was chopping off the hands of the Spanish for not paying their taxes because he was racist and expected the Spanish to know better, but did not hold the natives to the same standard. That is what he was imprisoned for. Just two here. But yes, there is a lot of misinformation in this thread. Story 28. I think much of the history we have learned has been altered or fabricated in an effort to shape the current world we live in. Story 29. The biblical Jews were slaves in Egypt and wandered the desert for 40 years. My whole life I thought this was true because I went to Catholic schools, but there is absolutely no evidence of it. Story 30. As a lifelong resident of North Carolina, we are about 95 to 98% sure what happened to the lost Roanoke colony. We are this sure because a few years later, after the colony was abandoned by the settlers, some of the children born in nearby Native American tribes had blonde hair and blue eyes. It is obvious that the Roanoke colonists either abandoned the settlement and the local tribes took them in, or the local tribes saw how troubled these colonists were and rescued them. Story 31. In school, they taught me that the Ku Klux Klan and the Black Panthers were the exact same thing, except the Ku Klux Klan hated black people and the Black Panthers hated white people. They said racism used to be a big problem, but the Civil Rights Act was passed and everything was fine now. Story 32. Men were hunters and women stayed in the cave, tended to the children and the fire, and gathered berries. In reality, evidence shows that women were hunters as well. Story 33. North Vietnam was not fighting for independence against the United States. They were conquering South Vietnam. It was a war of aggression by the communists. South Vietnam is almost absent in United States textbooks. Story 34. At this point, much of what is taught about Christopher Columbus' atrocities is not accurate. A significant portion of the actions attributed to him were actually committed by others who were even worse. I have even seen Columbus directly blamed for events that occurred after his death. However, the core of the accusations is true. Story 35. Ancient Romans disliked homosexuality, or ancient Romans liked homosexuality. In reality, homosexuality in ancient Rome was normalized and they did not mind it at all, but they absolutely hated non-masculine men. Story 36. There is a misconception in popular belief about the method of execution in gas chambers at Auschwitz, suggesting that gas came out of shower heads. I heard this a lot when I was a child as well. However, the actual method involved dropping pellets through wire insertion columns from the ceiling. Even in the movie Schindler's List, there is tension building up to the shower scene, but the showers only have water. It is unclear where this misunderstanding originates or why it continues to persist. This information is simply incorrect. Story 37. The X in Christmas actually means Christ. It is a symbol called a chi, usually used alone or as part of the chi-rho symbol, and is the first Greek letter in Christos. Early Bibles were written in Greek. This is also why the X appears in the ichthys, the Jesus fish design. It is not a recent invention. People have used the X to refer to Christ since before the modern Christmas holiday was established. It is one of the oldest symbols of Christianity, older than wearing a cross. Constantine used the chi-rho on his standard. Story 38. The early Filipinos before the Spanish and Americans were not brutish savages without culture. This is categorically false. They were an advanced Hindu-Buddhist and Islamic society that built ocean-faring ships and possessed abundant gold and resources. They were part of the extensive maritime Silk Road and had important ports crucial to the cultural and wealth exchange along the trade route. Story 39. Things about Cossacks in general. They do not have a pretty history. I mostly mean the registered Cossacks hired by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Zaporozhian host. Their image is the most famous. Please keep this in mind. I write this as someone who has roots in Ternopil Oblast close to Bogdan Khmelnytsky's home. Cossacks are overrated and they honestly hurt Ukraine's image. The idea that Cossacks wore big baggy pants and were primarily a cavalry force is not accurate. The pants were slimmer, and they mostly fielded infantry with muskets and spears. The top knot was a serious mark of brotherhood, but heavily embroidered shirts, common in modern Ukraine, were likely not used. They did not drink alcohol on campaign. That was forbidden. People often forget about the registered Cossacks. They were a large, well-paid entity under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Some argue they were better Cossacks than those from the Zaporozhian Sich. Most Cossacks came from the Ruthenian peasantry. Zaporozhye was the only Cossack host that enjoyed some free reign. Depending on the elected leadership, they were known for fighting with neighbors, fighting for neighbors, extended military campaigns abroad, and piracy, especially against the Ottomans. Their complicated relationship with the Crimean Khanate harmed their image. As for Bogdan Khmelnytsky, he is controversial. Briefly, he was a Ruthenian nobleman elected as a chieftain. He deliberately started an uprising against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, presumably for genuine reasons. It was a blood-soaked campaign that cost hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. Mostly the peasants suffered. The Polish, Lithuanian, and Ruthenian nobles did not lose much. Jewish people were targeted by the Sich. The Commonwealth was one of the few places in the world where they were protected. Also, peasants were sometimes given to the Khanate as payment. Next to the Ottoman Empire, the Crimean Khanate was the largest player in the Eurasian slave trade. I could go on, but I prefer to refer people to books instead. Any history book covering Ukraine and Poland will discuss Cossacks. Story 40, We Did Not Win World War II. Operation Paperclip gave Nazi scientists high-ranking positions in several government agencies, which continue to affect history today. Story 41, From Alabama, so pretty much everything about the Great War of Northern Aggression was a lie. Story 42, Paul Revere did not effectively warn about the British invasion. He was supposed to, but instead, he stopped at a bar, became intoxicated, and was captured before completing his mission. He only receives credit because his name is easy to rhyme with. Story 43. The Union fought to free the slaves. The publicly voted constitutions of Indiana in 1851, Oregon in 1844, and Kansas via the Topeka Constitution all banned black people, slave or free, from entering those states. In only one free state could black men vote, provided they paid a $200 fee. In the South, black men voted in Tennessee with no fee and might have voted in North Carolina, as their constitution did not specify a color barrier. The free states of Pennsylvania and some southern slave states sponsored the establishment of colonies in Africa, which became the nation of Liberia. The abolition of slavery was not built around equality. It was mostly religious, based on the idea that enslaving Christians was wrong. Regardless, abolitionists never held black people as equal. The Crittenden Amendment of 1860 and the Corwin Amendment of 1861 would have enshrined slavery permanently at the federal level but left it to the states to adopt state-based abolition as voters saw fit, which 50 to 70% of the South did. Of the few states that considered this before the war, the free states of Ohio and Rhode Island supported it and did not withdraw their support until the end of the war, when the equality aspects of the Reconstruction efforts were removed by mainline Republicans. The Confiscation Acts resulted in slaves who fled to the Union Army not being freed. They were kept in segregated concentration camps known as contraband camps. The slaves were federal property, unlike the slaves of captured Confederate officers at Camp Chase, Ohio. The camps were poorly supplied, and slaves died in large numbers from exposure and disease, much like Native Americans on reservations. The last slaves were not freed on Juneteenth. They were freed in December, over 8 months after General Lee surrendered. The Emancipation Proclamation did not free any slaves. It did not affect the half of the South still at war, the 5 Union slave states, or the concentration camps. Lincoln made specific exemptions against liberty for Union-occupied areas of New Orleans and Virginia to suit Northern white supremacists and the cotton trade. When General Benjamin Butler issued an emancipation order over his military district under martial law, Lincoln personally revoked it. The New York draft riot resulted in at least 120 deaths when New York's white supremacist majority rioted over the new United States draft. It was the first U.S. draft, and the idea of being forced to fight felt authoritarian. In response, they attacked black majority areas of New York and specifically targeted the homes of abolitionists to burn. The engineered failure of Reconstruction was the result of Northern white supremacy. The election of 1864 saw the Republican Party split into 2 parties, the National Union and the Radical Republicans. The Radicals broke off because the mainline Republicans did not want racial equality or land distribution to former slaves. The Radicals adopted their platform before the National Union and forced the National Union to adopt the bare minimum of abolition. Their party ran against the National Union until the last moment in November because they did not trust Abraham Lincoln to keep his word. Even then, 45% of the Union voted to maintain slavery, and the 55% who did not were mostly against the Democratic Peace Plan of General McClellan. Reconstruction was not a failure. There was no forgetfulness or betrayal within the party by Andrew Johnson. It was all planned. The myth that the Union fought to free the slaves did not gain traction until the civil rights protests linked to the Vietnam War, which gave Black Americans a fictional stake in a country that to this day does not see them as equal unless they are useful. The Union cared as much for Black people as they cared for Native Americans, whom they were committing genocide against. Story 44. Druids burning people alive in a large wicker man is most likely propaganda made up by Julius Caesar because he was at war with the Gauls. I grew up in a small town with very religious teachers. Some of them would often criticize other religions and give preference to Christianity. Story 45. After World War II, an uninhabited region of the Middle East was allocated to Jewish people to establish the State of Israel. Story 46. The Central Intelligence Agency has admitted to greatly exaggerating how bad Joseph Stalin was to the American public. Most of what we know about communist countries is either false or exaggerated. Story 47. Columbus was not a bad person. Most of our presidents were not bad people. The Civil War and civil rights were reasonable disagreements, and now racism is over. Story 48. Romulus and Remus come to mind. I have been searching but have not found a clear answer for how Rome was founded. Come on, people. Really? Story 49. A classic example, but the United States of America, the United Kingdom, France, and the other Western allies teamed up to defeat Germany in World War II. In reality, the war was primarily fought between the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and Germany. Story 50. The Wright brothers were the first to achieve controlled flight. It is likely that Gustav Whitehead flew an aircraft in 1901 or 1902, but he did not have any witnesses, publicity, or photographs of his achievement. The Wright brothers publicized their flight, which is why they are considered the first to do so in 1903. Story 51. 1. Women have always needed to work. There has never been a time in history when the average man could afford to be the sole provider for his family. White people did not start slavery. Throughout human history, slavery has existed in many cultures. In ancient Egypt, for example, it was common to enslave prisoners of war, which contributed to the construction of the pyramids. White people began enslaving Africans because Africans were already selling each other, and merchants saw profit in this trade. Racism, by the way, developed later. Despite the unequal social standards observed throughout history, such as in the Roman Empire, people did not really begin distinguishing races until the 17th century. Story 52. As a 1990s child born in Spain, Columbus was portrayed as essentially a savior. He was a visionary who rendered great service not only to the crown but also to Europe as a whole and introduced civilization to the indigenous peoples of America. I never gave much thought to him until recently, when someone commented on what a monster he actually was in the eyes of the rest of the world. Story 53. There was a smaller gate in the Jerusalem city walls called the Eye of the Needle. No such gate existed. It was a myth created in the 9th century by Catholic clergy to explain Matthew 19 verse 24. Again I tell you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God. This falsehood was a major basis for justifying the church accumulating wealth. Over 1,000 years later, we still have prosperity gospel preachers who use this myth to change the meaning of one of the few quotes attributed to Jesus. Story 54. Perhaps not necessarily untrue, but the way Henry Ford is glorified in schools as a titan of industry, creator of the assembly line, and so on. What they fail to teach, though, is how horrible of a human he was and just how anti-Semitic he was. Adolf Hitler literally looked up to this man and admired him. Let that sink in. The man responsible for the Holocaust, widely regarded as among the worst humans to ever step foot on this planet, admired Henry Ford and his anti-Semitic actions, including distribution of pamphlets, to the point that he is the only American favorably mentioned in Mein Kampf. Again, Adolf Hitler, murderer of Jews and responsible for the Holocaust, admired this man and wrote about him in his manifesto. Story 55. Up until very recently, I believed that slavery in the colonial United States was only an institution of the South. However, in the beginning, it was legal in every colony. It was not until shortly before the Constitutional Convention that the northern states outlawed slavery. This is not to equate the North and South. While the North has its own history with slavery, it ultimately abolished slavery on its own accord. The South clung to slavery to the point of starting a civil war, and even after that, some people continue to cling to the lost cause narrative. Story 56. Spain was neutral in World War II. Not really. Francisco Franco was a proper fascist and very enthusiastic for both Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. Spain was actively assisting the German war effort through various intelligence and military strategic means, also through raw material exports. There were also Spanish mercenaries who went to fight on the Eastern Front. Franco was playing both sides later in the war and stopped supporting Hitler when the Allies basically told him to. There was an oil embargo that put the Spaniards out of the game entirely. Spain did not join the war properly because they had just emerged from the 3-year civil war. Franco knew Spain had enough and was not up for more of that. He also had certain demands and wanted concessions that Hitler would not meet. Spain was neutral in that there was no declaration of war and the Spanish military were not actively fighting, but they were not like Switzerland or Ireland. Story 57. Columbus did not actually discover America for the Europeans. He landed in the Bahamas and never set foot in North America. Story 58. The First Council of Nicaea changed the words Anunnaki and Elohim in the Old Testament to God. If they were God, then that God is a monster. They were terrible, abusive gods that, if I were a Christian, I would know that. Story 59. Rome ended in 476 in the West. The Senate survived another 200 years in Rome, and in the East until 1453. Ostrogothic Rome was still populated by a majority of Romans and was well ruled by a king who heavily emulated his subjects' Roman imperial ancestors, Theodoric. He did much to preserve Roman culture and statehood. The East has a fascinating 1,000-year history that ends dramatically. It is somewhat ironic that the East was the first to spread the 476 myth as a justification for invading Ostrogothic Italy. The Gothic Wars with Eastern Rome destroyed Roman civilization once and for all in the West, as conditions deteriorated and plague struck, leading to a decline in culture and infrastructure. Story 60. George Washington did not chop down a cherry tree. Davy Crockett did not kill a bear when he was 3. General Andrew Jackson was not a great general. He only won enough before he died. His legacy was that future Confederate generals tried to emulate him, leading to major losses in manpower that the South could not afford to lose. Abraham Lincoln was not honest. He was a skilled politician. The Americas were not discovered by Christopher Columbus or Leif Erikson. Many people discovered the Americas and lived there for thousands of years prior. Emperor Nero and King Arthur are not anime characters. One was a real person and the other is a myth. All the events of history, both good and bad, were influenced by the actions of technically one person who has had several regenerations. The Doctor. Story 61. A simple answer. Any religious school history that includes an act of God refers to events beyond human control. For example, an extra bullet in a magazine is not an act of God. It is a bullet someone did not fire. The end of World War II was not an act of God. It resulted from Hitler killing himself and the army having no reason to continue because many of the Nazi soldiers did not want to be there. Story 62. Reddit claims that Thomas Edison was a hack with no skills who just stole other people's work. It is true that he was egotistical and took credit, but he was still a skilled inventor. Those comparing Elon Musk to Thomas Edison do not seem aware that Edison achieved much more, while Musk has done less. Reddit claims that Mother Teresa deliberately tortured people and did not provide them with medicine. The medicine in question simply was not available. She had flaws, but none involved deliberately causing suffering. This is just general Catholic context. Story 63. That XXXX won the War of 1812. No one really won, but all 3 parties involved benefited in some way. The United States of America was able to demonstrate their ability to take on the British Empire, thus confirming their status as a nation on the world stage. Britain successfully defended its colony. Canadians gained a sense of unity and nationality during the war and carried that with them. Story 64. Growing up, in my school years, I was told stories about the kamikazes. I was simply told that they were a group of suicide bombers for the Japanese government during World War II. They were even called baka bombs. Baka is Japanese for stupid. For the longest time, I wondered if that is how the Japanese people felt about it. I even called some of them by a derogatory term, but it was mostly because of my speech issues. I got into a lot of trouble for that. Ironically, not from the Japanese because they knew I struggled with my speech and was just a kid. Years later, I came to understand the truth behind the stories regarding what the Japanese people believed and learned that many of them were forced into such activities because of cultural expectations, while others were compelled by force. For many, they did not want to disappoint their families. Many Eastern religions, such as Shintoism and Buddhism, are rooted in family values, though both allow for some exceptions. I grew up Catholic, by the way, and was not taught much about other religions. The imperial government of Japan was somewhat like what a certain leader in the White House is trying to create today. I heard a story about a man who managed to survive 3 kamikaze attempts. He explained that those who survived were treated differently depending on whether they were forced into the mission beyond their control. For this man, 2 of his 3 attempts failed due to mechanical issues, so he tried again. The 3rd time, he missed his target and landed on an island. He did not return for a 4th attempt, believing he would be punished just for surviving. He stayed on the island until the war ended. If you are wondering, he witnessed someone who bailed out after 10 attempts being executed for cowardice. That is not all. I recently learned about a military regiment consisting of Japanese Americans serving in the United States. According to someone who served with them, these Japanese Americans were serious about protecting the United States because they considered the U.S. their family and were willing to protect their family honor. There were even instances in Japan where many Japanese people opposed the imperial government and provided information to the Allied forces, including the United States. There is a Japanese film called The Wind Rises, about the pioneer of early aviation in Japanese history, Jiro Horikoshi. Despite his Japanese patriotism, he was appalled that his creations were used in acts of war. Horikoshi wrote a journal entry about Pearl Harbor and his shame regarding those events. Story 65. No taxation without representation is a lie. I have no senators or members of Congress, and I pay a ton in taxes. Story 66. History in general whitewashes the revolutionary thinkers who are far more radical than we are taught, such as Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, Tupac Shakur, and Albert Einstein. Story 67. That slave trader John Newton survived a terrible storm, took his slaves back to Africa, and then wrote Amazing Grace. He did write Amazing Grace after surviving a storm, but he continued trading slaves until he retired from the trade. Story 68. Lenin and the Bolsheviks did not overthrow the Tsar. The Tsar abdicated during the February Revolution of 1917, when the provisional government and the Soviets came to power. Lenin overthrew the government of the liberals and other socialists in October 1917. Story 69. History is often taught by those who were not there. This has been the case for as long as humans have been writing things down. Story 70. Everyone thought the world was flat until Christopher Columbus proved it was round. Story 71. The Roman Empire fell in 476. Romulus Augustulus was not the last legitimate Western emperor. He was the son of a Balkan warlord who served the Huns but later offered his services to Rome. Odoacer was authorized by the Eastern Romans to take over the West, and the citizens in the West did not notice anything unusual. In reality, it was even a nicer few decades to live until the 520s and 530s, which were a markedly difficult time to be alive in Roman. Story 72. Lesson 1 of American history is a lie. The Pilgrim Fathers were fleeing religious persecution. However, not long after they fled England, there was a Puritan government in place. Somehow, they were portrayed as an oppressed minority seeking freedom, despite being powerful enough to execute the king after defeating him in a civil war. So persecuted. Story 73. The fall of Rome set the world back 1,000 years because of the Dark Ages and the knowledge and technology lost. Rome only collapsed in the West, continued in the East until 1453. They renamed themselves the Byzantine Empire. The vast majority of everything the Romans knew continued with them. Story 74. The Aztecs did not mistake Hernán Cortés for their feathered serpent god. They were a highly organized, sophisticated society capable of using common sense. This myth was spread by the Spanish, who depicted the Aztecs as primitive and ignorant. Story 75. Guy Fawkes was no hero. He only tried to blow up the despotic Protestant regime of his time to replace it with a despotic Catholic regime. The British have an entire holiday dedicated to burning him in effigy. Story 76. Where to start? Here are a few points from the top of my head, mostly from school. The Pilgrims left England not just because of religious persecution but for political reasons. King James had police watch churches because fake churches were already used to plot associations. The Pilgrims had several political messages against the royal family. The Plymouth Bay colony did not have religious freedom. Pilgrims executed people for even talking to members of other Christian groups. They also did not found the United States. Columbus did not discover the Americas. It was mentioned in Viking sagas. The British, Irish, Greeks, Egyptians, and others had stories about lands beyond the Atlantic. Colonization started after Columbus because he found resources that people in Europe wanted. Roman roads did need repair. Archaeology has proven this false. George Washington did not cut down a cherry tree as a child. That story is completely false, made up to add something to his biography after he died. People in most of history did move more than 5 miles from where they were born. Historic records and archaeology have disproved this repeatedly. There was not just one people group in Europe from the Stone Age to the present. Ancient DNA has proven that to be false. Archaeology and DNA evidence show several different people groups in Europe, some matching groups in early stories and legends. People were not illiterate in the Middle Ages. Archaeology has proven this false. Many common people could read and write, but not in Latin. Rome did not introduce writing and roads to Europe. Celtic tribes built and used roads dating back to the Neolithic. Writing systems predating the roads have been found. Literacy rates in Celtic parts of Europe during the Iron Age appear to have been higher than during the Roman Empire, though early paper may not have survived thousands of years in the dirt. Story 77. Neville Chamberlain knew full well that Adolf Hitler would break his agreement. It was only intended to buy time, which it did. The speech about peace for our time was just necessary political theater. Story 78. That Nazi Germany ever got close to winning World War II is questionable. They had a small window of opportunity after the fall of France, which was a mixture of luck, incompetence on the Allied side, and German commanders ignoring incorrect orders, for an armistice or peace settlement with the British if the evacuation of Dunkirk had failed. That still would have meant an attack on the Soviet Union, for which the German armed forces were never equipped or logistically prepared. The Nazi state and its armed forces were structurally and economically unable to achieve victory against the Allies. Defeating Britain alone, let alone the Soviet Union or the United States on their own, would have been beyond their means. The German economy and military were constantly walking a tightrope of near collapse, with rearmament having depleted nearly all strategic resources from 1935 onwards. The notion that if Germany had won certain battles the war would have ended in their favor is unrealistic when considering the economic and political conditions created by the Nazis. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.